It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello there, David.
Hello there. Good morning.
Good morning. And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody.
Now, Ralph, we're going to start off the show here. We've got a great show for you, but we're going to start off. You've got some things on your mind, a few issues you want to talk about before we dig into the body of the show. What's on your mind, Ralph?
Well, first of all, everybody knows that Joe Biden has selected Kamala Harris, senator from California, as his vice presidential running mate. And although many are pleased about the symbolic move that represents, we should remember two things. That in a poll a few months ago, a majority of African Americans preferred Elizabeth Warren over other black female potential candidates. Why? Well, because as black authors of an op-ed in the Washington Post a few weeks ago, she has actually walked the walk, not just talked the talk. She has fought corporations who are exploiting African Americans in a whole variety of ways: safety, health, insurance, and of course, economically. She's worked in the housing area. She's worked in the consumer credit and debit area. She's gone after payday loan rackets and rent-to-own rackets. That's number one. Number two, if you look at Kamala Harris's record, especially as Attorney General of California, she registers as a corporate Democrat. She's taken large contributions from Google, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, campaign contribution. When she was Attorney General, which is an office in California with a big staff and a lot of power, she didn't move against Silicon Valley on privacy issues, and she certainly didn't move on antitrust issues, allowing a lot of mergers to go through, especially Facebook acquisitions. And she was particularly egregious in dropping a case on a bank called One Bank in California that has exploited tenants mercilessly, driven people to foreclosures mercilessly, and it got into trouble. And it was called One West Bank, and it just happened to be run by Steve Mnuchin, who is the President Treasury Secretary Toady for Donald Trump. And in 2013, a memo from her own top prosecutors in Kamala Harris's Attorney General office wanted to move against One West. They said, quote, "It rushed delinquent homeowners out of their homes by violating notice and waiting period statutes, illegally backdating key documents, and effectively gamed foreclosure auctions," end quote. Pretty bad stuff on a big scale. And she dropped the case. She didn't move against One West. And 3-4 years later, guess who contributed to her Senate campaign? Steve Mnuchin. Now, a lot of this is all going to come out, and it's not going to be particularly edifying of Senator Harris. But on her behalf, I can say that she's very much like corporate Joe Biden. So Donald Trump and his horrific travesties and atrocities and disgusting pro-corporate behavior, bungling of COVID-19, lying as a daily practice on matters of significance, makes any Democrat candidate look good. But once he's displaced by a Biden-Harris administration, look for the huge and growing progressive wing of the Democratic Party to become very aggressively critical, because the choice of Harris instead of Warren in effect closed the door, which was already closing, on Bernie Sanders and his mass movement of progressive Democrats. Closed the door. Basically, Bernie Sanders is just left with a few planks, and not the most important ones, like single payer, at the Democratic convention. So that's one point I wanted to make. The second is pretty mundane. Anyone listening who has an auto insurance policy, you must have heard that the auto insurance companies are making big-time money because the traffic is down so much on the highways and traffic crashes are down, and they're keeping more of your premiums. And in May, some of the companies rebated $50 to you, but they've got to rebate a lot more. And the key expert on this, who we've had on the program, Robert Hunter, an actuary, a former federal insurance commissioner, is out with a statement on behalf of the Consumer Federation of America, calling on the state insurance commissioners to get with it and demand bigger rebates and refunds now that are owing you, the listeners, and everyone else who has an auto insurance policy. So pick up the phone, call your insurance commissioner and say, when are they going to act? Out of the 50, not counting Puerto Rico, out of the 50 insurance commissioners, only 4, most prominently New Mexico, has told the insurance companies to start writing checks and sending them back to their policy holders. The second quarter reporting of some of these companies is utterly staggering, like Geico. Geico in the second quarter of 2020 went from $393 million in profits in the second quarter of 2019 to $2.1 billion in the second quarter. And Geico is saying that they'll give you a rebate only if you renew the policy. That's a tying agreement that the insurance commissioners should prohibit. But it isn't just Geico. It's almost all the insurance companies are holding on to your premiums when they should be sending you refund checks. That's 2. The third, of course, was the weekend news last weekend that Mr. Trump is now seizing the authority of Congress. He thinks he's Congress. Remember, he said under Article 2, he can do anything he wants as president. Now he's taking over Article 1 by seizing the power of the purse and the power of taxing, which is exclusively the power of Congress, not the executive branch or the White House. And he's basically saying the Congress is do nothing. He's lumping the Democrats, who passed the $3.4 trillion relief bill last May, in with the do nothing intransigent Republicans who control the Senate. And he's telling millions of people with minimal rebuttal by the Democrats, who aren't very good at this communication process, he's telling them the Congress is do nothing, you're hurting, your $600 a week has expired, and I'm going to do it for you. Now, what I think the Democrats should be doing is going on national television and showing how they've already done not only $600 a week extended until January, support for the Postal Service. They have a major relief package for state and local governments who are hurting, and other things that they've done for student loans. And the Republicans can't even agree among themselves on what to do in the Senate, and they have gridlocked themselves. Now, most people don't know that. They have some vague feeling that the Democrats are more on their side, but the Democrats are stupefying. They're just not driving this home, given all the hundreds of millions of dollars of money they have for national TV ads and social media. And that's one. And then the executive orders or exhortations that Mr. Trump released while he was playing golf in New Jersey this last weekend are unconstitutional, clearly unconstitutional, and some violate the Anti-Deficiency Act, which says you cannot, as president, shuffle around money from one place to another unauthorized or unappropriated by Congress. And that's a criminal statute. So he is a criminal in trying to do this. And of course, his attorney general is not going to prosecute him. But that's just another criminal violation of Donald J. Lawless Trump. The last point I want to make is rather astonishing. In a survey last February, the Federal Aviation Administration surveyed its own staff, and according to Bloomberg News, which now has a copy of the report, and it is public, it's about 150 pages, a lot of the staff have told the survey that the FAA is too close to Boeing and too anti-safety. They don't respect the safety judgment of the FAA engineers and other experts. So there you are. We've been saying this all along. And it took 2 crashes in Indonesia and Ethiopia and 346 lives to wake up some people in the FAA to at least conduct this survey. I think it comes at an appropriate time because By reverse action, the FAA leaders, who the staff thought were not held accountable for these crashes in the way they allowed Boeing to regulate and certify itself, that the FAA is moving to let the Boeing 737 Max disaster plane to fly again sometime in late October. I think it's going to take longer than that because the airlines are canceling by the week all kinds of orders for the 737 Max, in part because the airline industry worldwide is contracting, and in part because of all the other problems that keep emerging about the 737 Max that they didn't bargain for when they ordered them from Boeing. I think that people still have a role to declare more and more that they're participating as air travelers in a consumer boycott of the 737 Max. And we have available, again, the button, Axe the Max, which if you go to nader.org, you can find out how you can acquire 10 of them in a package and send them to your friends, have your friends put them on their lapels, get up on Facebook or Instagram or whatever, and show Boeing one thing, that maybe they can control Washington, maybe they own the FAA, but that cannot control the customers of the airlines.
Well, that's a lot to unpack there, Ralph. Starting with Kamala Harris, you didn't really think that the masters of the universe were going to allow Elizabeth Warren to be in line for the presidency, did you?
Hope springs eternal, because there was one pragmatic reason for Biden's people to do that, which is she would hold on to more of Bernie's voters. And I think Kamala Harris, when all this pro-corporate stuff and non-prosecuting corporations, and how she defied a U.S. Supreme Court order to reduce the congestion in prisons in California. The prisons were packed with prisoners, twice the number that the prisons were built for, and she defied that. I think when more and more people realize that she wasn't all that good on criminal justice, whether it's street crime or corporate crime, they may stay home and just not vote. So I thought there was a glimmer of hope there, Steve, that pragmatic approach would work. African Americans were going to vote for Biden anyway. They showed it in the primary, and they're certainly not going to vote for Trump. So I thought, and others thought, that Elizabeth Warren, in addition to her record, her experience, her courage, her taking on the Wall Street control of America in so many ways, corporate welfare, corporate crime, etc., that they would give her an opportunity, but it wasn't to pass. And now they've closed out Bernie. And so they not just closed out Elizabeth Warren, they've closed out Bernie. And that's a big segment of the Democratic vote.
David?
Ralph, when Biden was picking his vice president, if he had to choose between Warren and Kamala and was told that you could win with Elizabeth Warren, but Kamala is more guardian of the status quo, he'll go with the guardian over the status quo over the person who will help him win?
Especially when he's ahead 10 to 12 points in the polls, and it may be widening. I think he was very close in the polls. He might have reconsidered the situation, because she's not going to bring California into the fold. California is Democratic big time. They're going to vote for Biden. So there wasn't much to argue for her compared to Elizabeth Warren in terms of the Bernie voters.
But so many people vote by what they think is it's like they're selecting the next host of the Tonight Show. And so they're looking at identity. They're looking at, they're checking off, the easy boxes, because it's more of a casting call than people really understanding what they stand for.
Well, you're right. That's true. And also likability. And Kamala Harris presents very well. She has a good facade. She is articulate. But when you look at the record, which is what all voters should look at, it gives great pause. We just put up on our website a memorable statement from Martin Luther King Jr. at the great rally in Washington, D.C. in 1963, the historic I Have a Dream speech. And he said, quote, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, end quote.
Well, on that note, let's get into the main show. Today, we're going to talk about the climate crisis because as at this moment, we're careening toward a point of no return. We must cut global emissions in half by the year 2030 if we want to avoid the worst consequences of this crisis. And it's going to require economic change at a speed and scale that has never been accomplished before. Despite the gravity of this problem, the media is not focusing on this issue. Stories about the climate crisis are getting drowned out by stories considered more urgent. That's understandable to a certain extent, but all of the inequalities laid bare by the pandemic are connected to the climate crisis and will be exacerbated by the greenhouse gases we keep pouring into our atmosphere. Good journalism is so necessary right now. People need to know what is at stake. So to talk about this, we've invited Kyle Pope. He is the editor-in-chief and publisher of the Columbia Journalism Review, whose spring 2020 issue focuses on how reporters have covered the climate crisis and, more importantly, the ways they haven't. Mr. Pope will be our only guest today, but we will, as always, take some time to check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. And if we have some time left over, we'll try to answer your listener questions. But first, let's talk about how the media covers climate.
Kyle Pope is a seasoned newspaper and magazine editor and reporter. He worked for a decade at the Wall Street Journal, has been editor-in-chief of the New York Observer, and deputy editor of Condé Nast Portfolio magazine. Mr. Pope is the editor-in-chief and publisher of the Columbia Journalism Review, whose spring 2020 issue discusses how reporters cover climate change. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Kyle Pope.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome indeed, Kyle. I remember when I was campaigning for the presidency in the Green Party in 2000, I would raise the issue of global warming again and again, and the press thought I was talking science fiction.
Yeah.
That was 2 years, by the way, before Frank Luntz, the wordsmith of the Republican Party, gave us the phrase climate change instead of global warming. He thought that was too alarming. He told the Republicans, just use climate change. Well, that's part of the media problem. They picked it up along with the Democrats using climate change instead of something that's more descriptive of the catastrophe, like climate crisis, climate chaos. And that's part of the problem I've had with the media. But you go much deeper in your Columbia Journalism Review article, and you go over time. You're not just talking about the last year or two. And one thing I found pretty amazing, I don't know why it's amazing, it shouldn't be. You write, in 2012, researchers at Media Matters found that U.S. news organizations gave 40 times more coverage to the Kardashians than to rising sea levels. During the 2016 campaign, reporters neglected to ask a single climate question in the 3 presidential debates. And in 2018, broadcast news outlets gave more airtime to the royal baby in England than to the warming earth, end quote. So you divide your analysis in past years up to the fall of 2019 when you said things got a lot better. So let's talk about the period of time before 2019 and what you're doing about it.
Yeah. Well, Ralph, as you point out, this is an extremely long-standing problem that I think is going to go down as one of the great failures of the modern press. The inability to treat this climate crisis as the crisis that it is just, frankly, I looking back on it now, I just find it sort of completely indefensible. I mean, the job of journalism is to sort of recognize problems and highlight them and figure out why they happen and then figure out what to do about it. There's just been a serial failure of journalism until very, very, very recently, and even arguably too late to do something about this. So I started thinking about sort of what we could do to fix this. I don't know if you want to talk about that now or if you want to still look at.
Yeah, I do want to ask you 2 questions responding to what you just said, Kyle Pope. Why did the media ignore it for so long? Was it because of big advertisements by oil, gas, coal companies? Was it just laziness? Was it just lack of affirmation of the crisis by the scientific community and groups like AAAS, the main scientific professional organization that should have blown the whistle on this. What was the reason for the neglect?
I think you put your finger on all of them. I think it was very complicated, and I think this was all part of it. I mean, let's begin, which I often do. Let's just begin with the assumption that the press's motives weren't terrible. Like, right? They didn't go into this thinking, how can we just sort of pick up the fossil fuel industry's line? There were definitely times when that was the case, but I don't think generally that was the orientation. I think that, though, most news outlets did not sort of recognize and appreciate the sophistication of the disinformation campaign that was aligned against them. I don't think they really have a sense of how focused the oil industry was in, I mean, as you say, like even the use of some of the language in sort of countering what was going on. I mean, you remember that Mobil for a long time had an op-ed on the op-ed page of the New York Times.
That's right. They paid $5,000 for the lower right corner. And they basically were part of the best read and most important op-ed of any newspaper in the U.S. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, that was an egregious error, and that was sort of an active disinformation campaign. But I just think that there was this sense of, like, we need to let both sides tell the story, and we need to sort of, like, not sort of, I mean, this was almost a different time in journalism where people really tried to stay right down the middle of the lane, which was, I think, in hindsight, a faulty sort of orientation, because it sort of, you know, and we're dealing with a lot of this right now as we debate how we should be covering Trump, which is that, in fact, there really sometimes aren't two sides. Sometimes there's one side of truth and then there's the other side. But I think it took a long time for the media to get their arms around that. That's problem one. I do think that the oil industry was a major advertiser. And as you know, I worked at the Wall Street Journal for a long time. And I can tell you that, I mean, nobody ever told me to write or to not write something based on advertising. But there is a kind of institutional bias and momentum and kind of unspoken pressure that comes into play at these places. And you know it, and I know it, and nobody likes to talk about it. But in fact, it's true. One of the things that this is actually one of the benefits of the change in media right now, which is that news outlets are much less beholden to advertising because the advertising's gone away. That's bad, but it's good in the sense that you don't get that kind of pressure anymore. So there was this kind of institutional bias towards these industries. There was a disinformation campaign that was unappreciated. And I just think that there was, you use the term laziness, and I think that that's absolutely right. I think there was just a sense of, like, there weren't enough science reporters. There weren't enough reporters who really took the time to study what people were saying, even though it was pretty obvious. I mean, we had Hansen go before Congress and lay it all out. I mean,
1988.
It wasn't that complicated, but it just took a long time for people to sort of get their arms around it. But again, like, I can go through all the reasons, but none of it's an excuse and all of it's a failure.
But part of it's still operating. For example, Congress has been gridlocked between the Republican Senate and the Democratic House. They really haven't had the high-profile hearings that they had in the auto safety period in the mid-1960s. If Congress doesn't have high-profile hearings, and there are all kinds of restraints that you mentioned on the press not covering climate chaos, then you don't get this wonderful cycle that works so beneficially when Congress does its job. It raises issues that the press is reluctant to raise. The press then routinely covers congressional hearings, and then you open up the system that way.
Yeah, that's all true. But look, I mean, you and I know that waiting for Congress to take action on systemic problems is like waiting for Godot. I mean, this stuff just doesn't happen. And the job of the press is to sort of get ahead of this stuff. The job of the press is to identify the problems that Congress needs to be paying attention to. The job of the press is to sort of force Congress to hold these hearings and to take action. And that's been part of this sort of systemic failure.
Well, I think to illustrate your point, we're talking with Kyle Pope, the editor and publisher of the prestigious Columbia Journalism Review. And look at the examples you give that make your point. I mean, these are easily reportable disasters, like the floods in Venice, the droughts in India, you point out, were ready-made for the evening news. Devastating fires in California and Australia led news broadcasts around the world. And yet, they didn't connect it to climate disruption.
Yeah.
And you say that sometimes there was almost a blackout of connecting it. Why didn't they connect it? There are plenty of scientists who would go on TV and radio to affirm their judgment in that respect.
You know, it's really interesting. So as we've tried to sort of launch this project to get media to do a better job of exactly making this connection, one of the bits of feedback, and we're not talking about like 10, 20 years ago, we're talking about like in the last year, 18 months, we've been getting from people is, well, we think that if we link weather to climate, it's going to be seen as political. We think that if we say, look, there's historic wildfires and they're going to get worse, and a warming world is one of the reasons why, there's going to be a portion of our audience who's going to say, oh, this is an anti-Trump thing, or this is a sort of Democratic Party thing, or it's a extreme environmentalist thing. And frankly, when myself and my colleagues went to talk to people about this and we heard this, we were taken aback because we thought we had passed that point. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
We thought that like that issue had been solved, but I can tell you that until very, very recently, and these natural disasters that you cite, those are the things that have finally forced the media to move. It finally became so impossible to ignore the fact that things were getting worse, and it hit people who normally wouldn't be inclined to agree with it. I mean, we had farmers in red states who would normally not be interested in hearing what climate scientists think, who were having to say, like, look, this is real, and I see it, and my family has been farming for 3 generations, and we've never seen flooding like this, or we've never seen fires like this, or we've never seen tornadoes like this. And they finally had to sort of like say, this is happening, and we can't deny it anymore. And then the media in those markets sort of finally picked up their openness and their willingness. I mean, we at CJR did a profile of a weathercaster in a red state in the Midwest who sort of talks about how that happened in his community and how for a while he was talking about the climate crisis and people would give him a hard time about it. And then finally it became the point where he was like, look, they're coming to me and saying, you're absolutely right. So the press, I don't know how much credit news organizations get on their own, but I think the story just became unavoidable and you couldn't not make the connection anymore. By the way, and I find this totally fascinating on the whole media sort of ecosystem, one of the groups that has been leading the charge on this, on connecting the dots between weather and climate, is local TV weathermen and weatherwomen, which is totally fascinating to me. And if you think about it, like, and it's a group of people that we have spent a lot of time trying to work with because in a lot of these local markets, they are the most respected media person in their community.
Certainly among the most watched, given how much time the evening news gives to weather forecasts. Right. 3-4 segments are devoted to variations on the weather. But let's talk about what you did about it. Kyle Pope actually did something with Mark Hertzgaard, a longtime writer on climate chaos and environment in general, with The Nation magazine. You started a group called Covering Climate Now, and it is expanded all over the world. Explain.
So, as you say, Mark is a terrific, longtime environmental writer who's written for The Nation and a lot of other places. And he and I have done some work together. And we were talking about our frustration around the lack of urgency on the media coverage of climate. And we did what every journalist does when they have an instinct like that, which is we said, well, let's write something. So we did, and we wrote a piece about how outrageous it was and how something needed to change. But then we started to feel like, you know what, that's not enough. We need to get people to move, and we need to get people to change their behavior. So we came up with this idea of a kind of collaboration of media organizations. And our idea was, let's get, if we can get a few dozen or a few hundred news organizations in the U.S. to commit to doing a better job of linking the weather to what's going on in climate and doing a better job of raising the visibility of the climate story, that's what we wanted to do. So we went around and talked to people, and this thing just caught fire and grew and grew and grew. And now it's the largest media collaboration in history. We have 400 news organizations from around the world representing an audience of about 2 billion people.
Name some of them.
We got CBS News, we got NBC News, we got Bloomberg, we got Reuters, we got Agence France Presse, we got The Guardian. I mean, literally in every part of the world, we have news organizations that are now part of this. And it's everybody from these big guys that I just named to very, very small radio stations and TV stations and newspapers, again, in every continent of the globe. And what they do is we have a weekly newsletter that goes out to everybody. And we sort of say, here's the climate, here's what's going on in climate that you ought to be paying attention to. Here are some stories from your colleagues in the partnership that you should pay attention to. And this is critical, Ralph. The really good work that a lot of people do, the members make it available free to other people in the collaboration. By the way, none of this costs anything. No one is paying a dime. No one is paying a dime to be a member of this. A lot of people are getting a lot of free content. The Guardian gives a lot of their climate content, which is excellent, by the way, free to members of this collaboration, as do other organizations. So a lot of people are getting a lot of stuff that they never would have gotten before. We do tutorials, we do webinars, we do what's called sort of weeks of coverage, where we say, you know, if normally you wouldn't be inclined to really focus on climate, just spend this week doing it, just for a week, see what it feels like. And we did the first one of those last September, and it was great. It was during UN Climate Summit, and during that week, Google search terms of climate hit a historic record high, and partly because of this collaboration. So Mark, especially, who is the executive director now of this project, it's a standalone for-profit. We were funded initially with help from Bill Moyers, and this is great for your listeners. If anybody wants to donate to Covering Climate Now, we'd love to have you. But Mark spends a lot of his time talking to news directors and producers and editors about what does your climate coverage look like. We do a lot of connecting to people. You know, we had recently, you know, somebody called, one of our partners from the Netherlands called and said they need help with a story they're doing that has something to do with Brazil. Could we connect them to a Brazilian partner, which we have, so we're able to make that connection. So we're just trying to sort of stitch together this network that has previously not really existed.
Here are some of the questions you want the press to dig into, according to your article in Columbia Journalism Review. And I'm quoting you. Can we ensure that the disasters we watch unfold are contextualized and explained? Will we hold the villains of the crisis accountable? Are we able to write about solutions to problems without trivializing them? How can we be fast and slow? The matter of whether or not the climate story should be told is settled. We must. This issue of Columbia Journal Review is focused on ways of doing the job, end quote. Well, are there some big news outlets turning their nose up at this? I mean, is the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, and Associated Press part of your collaboration?
I have to say this gingerly because we're working on everybody. We're hoping to turn them. I can tell you that Rupert Murdoch is not a fan of this effort. So if there's a Murdoch publication, whether it's the Wall Street Journal or Fox or the Times in the UK, wherever it is, they're not interested. The New York Times, we've been having a lot of conversation with them. They do really good work. They have taken the view that they don't need this kind of collaboration because they have a staff that's big enough to do it. We've countered to them that, you know, they can be a really powerful role model for people if they join in. That's definitely been the stance that Reuters has taken, which again has a huge staff, but they view this as an opportunity for them to help the rest of the journalism business. So we've had great success, but there are some of these places that for institutional or ownership or just kind of culture reasons, we haven't been able to get on board, but we're working on them every day.
Well, the New York Times has done great graphic spreads to bring home the climate catastrophe. I mean, I'm really amazed at the amount of space they've given. And the question I have is, do they ever share these great graphics with your collaborators after they've printed it in the New York Times?
No, but they would if they were part of the collaborative. I mean, they did, to your point, they did this piece, I don't know if you saw it a week or so ago, about heat around the world and what the warming planet means for people who are dealing with extreme heat. It was extraordinary. It was amazing pictures. It was amazing graphics. It was amazing reporting. It was amazing writing. It was fantastic. And, you know, more of that, please. But I do wish that they were part of our collaborative so they could share it. But right now they're not.
Well, people listening may have contacts in the local press. Give the website where they can find out more about what you're offering and be participants.
Yeah, coveringclimatenow.org is the website. On there is a list of all of our partners, again, 400 and counting. There's a FAQ page that'll explain, you know, what being part of the collaborative means. And again, just to make sure everyone's clear, nobody pays a dime. Nobody's obligated to give or not give their content, although we encourage people to do that. Nobody's obligated to participate in the tutorials or not participate, but we encourage all of that.
Well, you have this question I want you to try to answer when you say, will we hold the villains of the crisis accountable? Question. Who are the villains? How would you hold them accountable from a journalism point of view? I mean, you're not an attorney general or a prosecutor.
I'm not, although attorneys general and prosecutors are looking at these questions about misinformation around climate. I mean, I think this is a big, juicy journalistic project, going around and figuring out where does the fossil fuel industry spend its money on lobbying? Who is it funding in terms of local candidates? What kind of advertising or other support has it been given to local press? Where are local think tanks and even local academic institutions that sort of pose as independent? Where are they actually funded? And is the funding influencing what they say? This is what we're talking about. And I do think this will come. I mean, you've been fighting these kind of fights your whole career, and these are complicated stories. One of the sort of tragedies, really, is that the need for this kind of reporting is so acute now at exactly the moment that resources in local newsrooms is so terribly low. So it really is going to take collaboration. I mean, I don't care what city you live in or what your local newspaper is, but unless it's one of a handful in the country, it's been gutted. And so these people really need your support. And, one of the heartening things that we've learned as we've tried to put this collaboration together is that in newsrooms, large and small, in the U.S. and around the world, there are people inside those newsrooms who really care about this subject. And sometimes all they needed was somebody like CJR who would back them up and say, like, look, we'll sort of tab your back if you go to your boss and say, like, we need to add some resources to this. And that's happening. But ultimately, the money really isn't there. So we need to work together. And that's one of the reasons why we have this collaboration.
Well, what isn't complicated is the Trump and Trumpsters move over the last 3.5 years to unleash more greenhouse gases and lift regulations from the emitters, especially methane. And how many years did it take when the press would dutifully say that a good transition fuel to replace coal is natural gas, but if natural gas is emitting methane, methane is anywhere from 20 to 80 times more devastating as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, and they never would point that out. And of course, Trump has now allowed the producers of methane to be even less regulated, and more of it is going into the atmosphere. I think the media has been far too soft on Trump. It's as if, well, there he goes again. It's not news. What they don't really appreciate, the media, is that inaction or refusal to act is just as newsworthy as bad affirmative action, like Exxon pouring stuff into the atmosphere.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with you. I mean, one of the things that we're trying to do is highlight the fact that this really is a pivotal election for the climate. I mean, the science tells us that we are at a tipping point on so many of these problems. And, this has been building for decades and decades and decades, but it's here. It's here now. And unless we do something right now, unless we really focus people's attention on it right now, it's going to be very, very, very hard and maybe even impossible for us to recover. So that's one of the points that we're trying to make.
Well, before we have Steve and David weigh in here, I want to ask you about the Amazon. Bolsonaro, the Trump-like head of Brazil, has scoffed at the Amazon. He has said it's to be developed. It's ours, and so the fires are raging. The ranchers are burning more of the Amazon to produce food temporarily because the soil is so fragile. It's only good for about 3 or 4 years. And it's a total global disaster. The Amazon has been called the lungs of the earth, and I don't think the media is doing anywhere near what it should on this subject. What would you propose be done fast?
Yeah, I mean, I think institutionally, there's a lot of the same issues that you talked about with Trump as with Bolsonaro, which is we've seen it with the coronavirus too, which he eventually got. Just the sort of blizzard of lies and the blizzard of deceit, and the press becomes a sort of inured to it. It becomes almost a kind of call it a joke, I think is probably a little extreme, but it just becomes something that people just sort of roll their eyes and shrug their shoulders with. I have seen some pretty good reporting about what's happening in the Amazon. It tends not to be broad. I mean, the New Yorker has done some fantastic work. Again, the New York Times has done some fantastic work. And there's actually, despite a very fractured media environment in Brazil. We actually CJR publishes a Portuguese language edition in Brazil, so I'm a little familiar with the media landscape there. They've got some good reporting. I mean, there's a reporter, ironically, for the Financial Daily there who has made more trips to the Amazon than any other reporter in the world.
As you know, the COVID-19 epidemic is devastating indigenous people in the Amazon, which further complicates the situation as their lands are being dispossessed by illegal movers into the Amazon. But Kyle, I really have to point something out here. I don't think dramatic feature stories, which are usually offered for Pulitzer and other prizes, have anywhere near the impact of daily reporting the issue. Reporting the issue on the Amazon. You know, the Times has had a few great features, but then it's over. They don't keep on it. And I've had members of Congress tell me that unless there's daily reporting on what they're doing, investigating the insurance industry or what's happening in the public lands, that the feature doesn't work. It's a one-day impact, and then it goes away. And the culprits know it, too. They know the difference between a feature offered for a prize and on-the-ground continual reporting.
No, I agree with you. I think there's a problem with follow-through across media where our attention spans have become so limited, and the sort of demands by social media to come up with something new every day make follow-through really hard. The other issue that we haven't really talked about is that most people, certainly most Americans, get their news from television. So whatever the New York Times does, whatever the Washington Post does, whatever the New Yorker does, isn't going to move the needle in a way that's going to be effective. We have to get these stories on TV. We have to get them on the evening newscast. And, they unfortunately have been among the biggest laggards. Again, I think we're seeing progress. We're seeing substantive progress now, but it's been very, very slow. And I think that's why these stories have been so slow to take hold.
Maybe you ought to inform your readers, listeners, viewers that the public airways are owned by the people. They're the landlords, and the radio and TV stations are the tenants that pay no rent. They get the license free. You pay more for your auto license than the biggest NBC station in New York. And people have got to start making demands. It's our public property. They got to keep saying that. They got to call up the TV and radio stations. So what is all this nonsense here? Most of it is entertainment and advertising. And you give us this little evening news that's full of weather and sports and chit-chat and doesn't even have much news in it. And so, anyway, I think what you're doing is great. I think other journalism reviews should be as expansive in their horizons. And what do you think, Steve and David?
I have a question about money, if you don't mind. You were talking about the mobile ads that appeared on the op-ed page in the New York Times. The problem with politics is always money, and the problem with journalism is money. So what is the chilling effect we see with Koch brothers money, Exxon money, British Petroleum money, not just on the network news, but in journalism schools?
The Koch brothers don't give any money to our journalism school or to CJR nor does Exxon. But we've written the Koch brothers are being fairly aggressive in contributing to journalism. And, no doubt this is one of the reasons why. But I think the climate has changed to the point that when they do give this money and when this money does show up, they're called out on it. I mean, these organizations are called out on it, and they're called out by us and other people. And I think that's progress. To your broader point, I do think that this is a moment of vulnerability for journalism, that, the economic need is so intense and there's so many places that are just hanging by a thread that, people are going to be more inclined to take money from people they editorially shouldn't be taking money from. So that sort of falls on us as a watchdog to try to protect against that and to call people out when they do that. But there is a vulnerability now that we have to really pay attention to.
Steve?
Yeah, Kyle, I want to talk about the Green New Deal. In your estimation, the media done a good job of explaining that and putting it in its proper context?
No. I think that they've been too willing to let the right frame it as a personality issue and make it an AOC story, which I think is wrong. I think it's much broader than that. And I think there's also this kind of fake urgent need to understand the economics. Like, well, that's great, but where's the money going to come from? The press isn't asked that about like new military projects. They're not obsessed with urgently knowing how we're going to pay for it. But I think that's a frame that they bought into. Again, you see some people pushing back on that in the press. I mean, I don't know if you guys follow Vox that closely, but they've done some terrific explainers on the Green New Deal and some terrific analysis of why it's important and how people need to pay attention to it. But I think it's been, I don't think it's been covered very effectively. And I think it's been, the press has allowed it to be framed by the right in a way that's not helpful.
Are we beyond denial now? Are we now just in the phase where it's about how urgent it is, how fast to move?
I mean, it's hard. It's always hard to generalize these things. I can tell you that if you're a media outlet that's not a right-wing media outlet and you give prominence to deniers, you're going to get called out for it. And people are going to say, this is not journalism. So I think that's a sign of great progress. But I think the oil industry and the right have figured that out. Even amongst people in the energy business, you don't see them trying to trot out just outright denial that much anymore. Now the argument has shifted to, well, yes, it's a problem, but we have a lot of problems. And are we really willing to wreck our economy to fix this? Is that really the future you want? That's the new line. That's the new line you see it around the Green New Deal and around all this.
Indeed, Kyle Pope. There's some promising trends here. One is that wind power and other forms of solar energy are outcompeting any forms of fossil fuel deployment like coal and oil and gas. And so they're getting a bigger share of the market, and that's good for the climate situation. And the insurance companies for years, and the reinsurance companies like Swiss Re, they've been very worried about their liabilities and all the damage like rising sea levels and droughts and floods and hyper hurricanes. But they need to be more aggressive. I know they have clients in the fossil fuel industry, so they're sort of torn. They need to be more aggressive because they can be very powerful on legislatures and public opinion. And the growing number of young people, sparked by Greta and others, marching. It reached several millions a few months ago, last September. The COVID crisis has stalled it, obviously, but I think it's going to come back. Millions of young people marching all over the world. So, and then there's the Drawdown Project that Paul Hawken helped start, which is chronicling effective work by people all over the country, actually reducing the carbon imprint of what they were doing. And in concluding, Kyle Pope, you have retained a printing company for the paper edition of the Columbia Journalism Review, where you say, Allied Printing, I'm quoting, Allied Printing, the company we've hired to produce the magazine, has a zero carbon footprint. Nearly 3/4 of the energy used at its facility comes from the wind and solar power. To further minimize our climate impact, we've elected to print half the number of issues we typically would, which helps us offset the cost of eco-friendly printing and distribution. We've also made every effort possible to reduce travel for our writers and photographers, end quote. So you're walking the walk, you're practicing what you preach. Thank you very much for coming on and enlightening us about this great new project by the Columbia Journalism Review in cooperation with Mark Hertzgar of The Nation. And once again, just give our listeners the website.
Ralph, it's an honor to be on with you. The website is coveringclimatenow.org. coveringclimatenow.org. Well, to use the cliche, this has to be continued. It's not going to go away, climate chaos. Thank you very much, Kyle, for your contribution and redefining the scope of journalism. Thanks for having me.
We've been speaking with journalist Kyle Pope. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Let's take a short break, but first let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, August 14, 2020. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Corporate crime and punishment, the crisis of under-enforcement. That's the title of a new book by Columbia Law professor John Coffey. We are moving from a system of justice for organizational crime that mixed carrots and sticks to one that is all carrots and no sticks, Coffey writes. Coffey offers a series of proposals for ensuring that corporate crime can once again be punished. He describes incentives that could be offered to both corporate executives to turn in their corporations and to corporations to turn in their executives, allowing prosecutors to play them off against each other. Coffey proposes that whistleblowers be offered cash bounties to come forward, and all federal enforcement agencies be able to hire outside counsel on a contingency fee basis. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Hey, let's do some listener questions. This question comes from Abby Knowlton, and it sort of speaks to the Kamala Harris discussion. She says, Dear Ralph, how do you respond to those who continue to repeat the lesser of two evils voting message, especially respected intellectuals like Noam Chomsky? It infuriates me that they mindlessly belabor this asinine talking point every election, despite the fact that it has always backfired, particularly in 2016. I turned 18 years old 2 weeks before the 2000 election, and I walked in a snowstorm to the polling place to vote for Gore. I was appalled by his spineless concession, and I still regret ever supporting the Democratic Party Corporation. I have been a member of the Green Party for about 10 years now. How do you argue against the lesser of two evils stance? I look forward to your show every week. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Abby. On behalf of Noam Chomsky, what he says is in the slam dunk red and green states, you can vote for Green Party. In the swing states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, he says the difference between Biden and Trump is the difference between a bad administration and a catastrophic, insane administration, and he would urge you to vote for Biden. So he is a bit nuanced on that. My position is every 4 years, the Democrats engage in political extortion and political bigotry by calling, for example, Green Party candidates spoilers. Well, for years now, the Democratic Party could have avoided that kind of bigotry by adopting rank voting or instant runoff voting. They never supported it publicly. Number two, they could have supported the end of winner take all. They could have supported proportional representation the way they have in Europe. They never did it. They could have gotten rid of the Electoral College by supporting national popular vote movement that gets states to pass laws saying that whoever wins the national popular vote as a presidential candidate will give that person our Electoral College vote, thereby neutralizing the Electoral College in the Constitution, because the states in the Constitution have the authority to set rules for federal and state elections. So they haven't done that. So every 4 years, people who want to vote their conscience are supposed to be excoriated as spoilers. And look at the spoiled political system that this fosters, because the more the two parties discourage people from supporting challengers, the more one bad party will get worse and pull the other less bad party, but still bad party, in its direction. That's what's happening now. The Republican Party is extremely reactionary and corporatist and warmongering, and the Democratic Party has felt that it can support all these massive military budgets that aren't audited because the Republican Party is giving them room to do that on the political spectrum. So my approach is always vote your conscience, vote who you believe in, support a competitive democracy, and it's certainly up to the two dominant parties to explain themselves as to what they have done to the country and how they've turned Washington into a bipartisan corporate state, Wall Street over Washington, D.C. It's also important to know that nothing stops the Democratic Party from seizing the Green Party agenda, most of which is supported in the polls by a majority of Americans. So what are they supposed to say?
Yeah,
we don't want to adopt majoritarian positions. Go to my website, which is still open for this purpose and this discussion, votenator.org. It's a 2008 campaign, and you'll see over a dozen wildly popular proposals that the Green Party and I were making, I was running as an independent, that the Democrats and Republicans took off the table, wouldn't even discuss in the debates or in the campaigns, off the table. VoteNader.org. How many quadrennials are we going to allow these two parties to drag our democracy down into the dark pits of corporate statism? So, this is a discussion that continues to go on. But you say to your Democratic Party critics, why aren't you for rank voting? That's a simple way to deal with the problem of, quote, spoiler, which is a politically bigoted word because it's only applied to third-party candidates, not to Republicans and Democrats. They don't apply it to each other.
I remember the days, 2004, the anybody but Bush days, when Bush was Satan. And now Bush looks like a distinguished statesman compared to Trump. So the arc of what you're talking about, where the opponent on the right gets worse and worse, has been proven over the last 20 years.
Precisely. I mean, there were liberal Republicans 30 years ago who were behaving like liberal Democrats. No more. There aren't any in the Senate and the House. They keep being pushed into more extreme reactionary corporatist warmongering positions. So there's a moral obligation there to say enough is enough. But, for most people coming up in November, most states, you can vote green in Alabama, it's going to go Trump. You can vote green in New York State, it's going to go Biden big. There's a few states you have to make up your own mind. Vote your conscience or engage in tactical voting.
I want to thank our guest, Kyle Pope, again. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up. A transcript of this show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our intern is Michaela Squire. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we welcome author and economics columnist Robert Frank about his new book, Under the Influence, Putting Peer Pressure to Work. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. And listeners, demand your auto insurance premium refunds. Demand them directly from your auto insurance company and demand that your insurance commissioner go to bat for you.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the Wrap-Up. First, David, Steve, and Ralph talk about the political scene.
Biden's going to lose, isn't he, Ralph?
No.
Really? Okay.
There's only one way Trump can win, and that is massive vote manipulation suppression in 5 states. But, regardless of his illegality over the weekend, he lumped the Democrats into a do-nothing Congress assault. And they derided him. They're into derision. They think derision is a response to Trump. Instead of putting out a $10 million ad buy and showing that they did their job in May, ABCD, $600 a week, and Republicans can't even agree on how much they're going to strangle the people economically over in the Senate.
When you said that originally, Ralph, that really resonated because it's like, yeah, they're not saying that. They should be saying, listen, we're going to give you $600 and we passed this in May.
Yeah.
And so the reason we're held up is because they can't decide among themselves whether it's going to be 300 or 400 and whether the states are going to pay for it or the federal government. And I saw Larry Kudlow on one of the Sunday shows, I think with Dana Bash, and he had no idea what he was talking. It was like, yeah, well, 1,200, 800, 400, 300 plus 100 here. It was just a magic show.
He just controlled the whole news cycle for 3 days. And he had NPR and the Washington Post and Times saying, it's not clear whether he has the authority. We sent stuff out saying, not clear? What are you, nuts? The power of the purse and the power of taxation, it's not clear whether he has authority to seize Congress or constitutional authority. They're not tutored. They're not tutored. And when he does this on a weekend, people like Nina Totenberg and Adam Liptak, they can't get to these reporters and say, stop saying it's not clear. It is clear. And so he dominated the whole news cycle. And Steny Hoyer comes on NPR. I thought he had marbles in his mouth. He was unable to articulate what you just said, Steve. That's the answer to your question, is the stupefying Democrats losing an opportunity to take advantage of an opportunity as it goes.
I can't understand whether it's incompetence or it's they're trying to be careful because they're usually in these cases, it's like you're trying to walk some tightrope, some line. You don't want to offend these people over here or this group.
It's the Pelosi syndrome. When you're ahead in the polls, don't rock any boat.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a strategic lack of aggressiveness.
Yeah. It's a Hillary Clinton smugness.
Yeah. And Trump, against Trump's aggression and where he just outright lies, I think Trump is like the worst ventriloquist act. He makes no attempt to throw his voice and no attempt to stop his lips from moving. And yet he can still make people believe that the dummy's doing the talking.
Yeah. And you can't get the Democrats on Capitol Hill to demand that he and Pence step aside from bungling and mismanaging the COVID thing as the death smell.
Yeah.
And put the professionals in charge. We even have drafted legislation, Steve, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
Bruce Fein and I. And there's no answer from the Democrats on the Hill. We sent it to all the people that are supposed to be interested in this, and there's nothing. And that's why we're trying to get Public Citizen to take a big stand here.
And now Ralph answers your questions.
David, why don't you do the honors?
This comes to us from Robin LeConche. He writes, gentlemen, can we get a follow-up on the interview of Andrew Kimbrell? Many points were raised about what's going on at labs with implications of disastrous bioengineering possibilities. This requires substantiated fact-finding from second and third sources. Without further investigation, that portion of the show comes off as alarming and conspiratorial. One viewpoint is not enough, even with compelling questions.
Well, I think what Andrew Kimbrell is preparing is a more major report where he cites a lot of scientists who say, and this is the reason why he's doing this, is that funding research in labs, whether in China and elsewhere, to make viruses more virulent as a scientific quest is inadvisable given the poor security of these labs in terms of negligently allowing these viruses to escape containment. I think that's his main concern. And he also has demonstrated that the National Institutes of Health has supported what they call gain of function research, and what he calls gain of threat research. And what else is confirmed is that years ago, when the U.S. had a biological warfare program to compete with the Russians, Soviet Union times, before Richard Nixon stopped the program, the Pentagon indeed was funding research, as University of Wisconsin, research on how to make viruses and other contagious microorganisms more virulent, like dengue fever. A University of Wisconsin scientist reported on page 1 of the Wall Street Journal on a Pentagon contract. So I think that's what he's doing. He's not arguing against conventional scientific research at all on viruses. In fact, he applauds it and supports it.
This next question comes from John Fitzgerald. It says, thanks, Ralph, for hosting Greg Palast. To his advice and yours, I would add that all the kinds of public interest groups, by the way, Greg Palast was talking about voter suppression. He says, his advice and yours, I would add that all kinds of public interest groups you mentioned should be pressing Pelosi to insist on providing a citizen suit provision to enforce federal election laws with market rate fee shifting and expedited procedures. I have asked Public Citizen, Common Cause, and many others, as well as several members of Congress, to do this and provided draft language, but no one has taken it up. Election law expert Chris Sauter thinks the draft amendment is great. Can you help?
I've always supported the right of people to file these civic action lawsuits because it's a way to put pressure on the authorities to enforce the law. And if you're not getting a response from these groups, I suggest that you call Attorney Paul Levy at the litigation group and Public Citizen, 202-588-1000, and ask him his opinion of this.
And I should mention John Fitzgerald is the co-founder of InPurg, which is, I guess, the National Purg Clearinghouse.
This next one comes to us from Mark Erickson. He says, Ralph, there's been a lot of talk about cancel culture recently, and it reminded me about the parts in your book, How the Rats Reformed the Congress, when people began chanting, resign, resign, to their elected leaders. Public accountability seems to be at the heart of it. Is resigning or being fired the only appropriate response when a faux pas or more egregious act or statement is made? Or is owning mistakes and an authentic commitment to reform or repentance good enough? It also reminds me of the blackface issue. I believe a few public figures were forced to resign when it was made known that they had used it, but others publicly owned their mistake and stayed in office. Interested in your thoughts, Ralph. Thanks again for all that you do.
Well, in my book, How the Rats Reformed the Congress, you can get it by going ratsreformcongress.org. You should remember that some of the members in the Congress who were hearing these mass rallies right outside the Congress, resign, 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 and the rallies had good arguments for that, came out and joined the people. Whether they were already progressive or they repented, the people accepted them. So I'm all for redemption if it's authentic, repenting, fine. And sometimes you're going to have to take the hard line, demand resignation. Mitch McConnell's never going to repent. The word for him is resign or be defeated in Kentucky.
I just want to say one thing on this. Ralph Northam is the governor of Virginia. He was caught wearing blackface. He's still the governor. Prime Minister of Canada, Trudeau, blackface, still in power. Jimmy Fallon, Jimmy Kimmel, all wore blackface. They apologized. They're still in power. I think the cancel culture is based on what people do, not how they behave or what they say.
Yeah, and also it's when they did it. For example, the governor of Virginia did it when he was in a play during medical school many years ago. In a play many years ago. Obviously, it depends on when, where, how.
A lot of people are conflating cancel culture with sexual assault. So a lot of people claim it's the cancel culture that got me fired, when in fact, it's not what the politician or the celebrity said. It's what they did. And they're hiding, they're taking cover behind the cancel culture. Very devious.
These are the 2 or 3 word phrases that are abstract enough to try to avoid people from saying, never mind what you're labeling it. What's the real evidence? What are the facts?
Right.
And we know, people critical of the Israeli government are called anti-Semitic when they support Palestinian rights. And we have people critical of Wall Street and they're called socialists or anti-capitalists. It's a way to avoid addressing the facts of the matter on all sides.
Okay, this next question comes from Jim Haber. He's hearkening back to our interview of Frank Luntz last month. And he says, I was appreciating the interview until Frank Luntz assigned all blame for the Palestinian people's plight on their leaders. Even after Ralph put out the 400-to-1 kill ratio of the Israeli state-sanctioned violence versus relatively unorganized Palestinian violence. He said, I wanted more pushback rather than letting his rants on the Palestinian leadership go on so long and not be answered. He says, I missed this week's shows, so maybe you spoke to this point already. And he was also moved by the pushback your commentator, and I believe he means Mr. David Feldman, gave against his questionable sage advice for the Democrats.
Well, that was only part of the interview of Frank Luntz. We talked about his wordsmith approach to political language. And we've had programs on the Palestinian-Israeli issue where a lot of these points were made more fully. Thanks very much, Jim.
This is from Barbara. Ralph Nader has always been my hero, and I absolutely love listening to this radio hour every week. Thank you all for bringing these important and relevant issues to my attention. Have you ever thought of interviewing Professor Richard Wolff? That would make an interesting one. Thanks again.
Yes, Barbara, I have. I listen to him once in a while on community radio. He is a professor of economics and an avowed socialist and tough critic of capitalism. And he has DVDs and articles and books that he makes available to his circle of supporters on his radio program. Yeah, if you can get him to return our calls, we'd love to have him on.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week when we welcome author and economics columnist Robert Frank to talk about his book, Under the Influence, Putting Peer Pressure to Work. Until next time.
Stand up, you've been sitting way